Um, yeah, maybe show of hands. I'm not curious on the room. Like, who here are founders? Oh, great. A lot of founders. Operators, people who work in a startup or in a company. Investors. Good. So there's a lot. So founders remember the investors. Investors remember the founders, right? Always an interesting dynamic to have that, right? So really quick, hello everybody. My name is Earl Valencia. I am a founder. We just exited the company earlier this year. Venture-backed company. I used to also be a VC investor, invested in I think probably 30 companies before. But then one thing I'm here because I just wrote a book and it got picked up by Penguin Random House called Startup Mindsets, and it will be published, I guess, in a few months. So the first market will be in Singapore, but then it'll go to the US and all over the world in January. So hopefully you'll remember that. You can pre-order at Amazon. So people know I'm from the Philippines. I'm Filipino, and I'm also the presidential advisor for the country on innovation. Right? So I got appointed last year by the president of the Philippines. So one thing I want to talk about today, maybe 10, 15 minutes, is a little bit on the key mindsets based on some of the research we did for the book, right? The book is specifically thinking about what takes it for someone to take the leap from -1 to 0. There's a lot of discussion now, like from 0 to 1, but actually very few books talk about how to actually make and give the courage for someone and what questions to ask. Should I start a company? Should I start an initiative? Should I start even a project and leave what I think is comfortable, right? I think that's really something that I think if we address that question and hopefully demystify that, then more people will start more companies, right? In fact, I just moved here to the Pacific Northwest maybe like 8 weeks ago. And one thing I've noticed is that this whole place actually is optimized for big tech, right? So as founders, very difficult because the alternative for you to just stay in Microsoft or Amazon or others is very, very strong. So I kudos for all the founders here because ultimately it is not easy, right? Compared to places like Silicon Valley where I used to live, everybody there is like a founder. But here, I literally in my neighborhood, very few people are. I tell people, oh, are you guys a founder or startup founder? No, right? I work for big tech. So that's why I think it's important for all of us to build community because ultimately it's founders and investors alike is what actually propels the ecosystem forward, right? So my talk really is about what are the 5 questions that you should answer before starting a startup, or maybe you're already a founder now, the questions maybe you should have asked yourself before starting a startup, right? So why did we also start and write the book? And the reason is this. So I grew up in the Philippines, and when I went to Silicon Valley and I looked at like, what are all the books and who are the authors of most of these books? And who are the articles written about? And I saw this one. It's like, wow, the founding fathers of Silicon Valley doesn't look like me. Doesn't look like my kids. Doesn't look like my mom, right? So how is that, right? So if I look at like the benchmark and I ask myself, are we represented in the Silicon Valley ecosystem? And the answer is maybe not, right? And one thing that I realized, in order for you to understand, so I was walking in San Francisco in 2019 with one of my friends, and we asked ourselves, we are in San Francisco, but how do you actually become part of Silicon Valley? So my friend, who my co-author of the book, grew up in Daly City, which is in San Francisco, his entire life. And then he just went to a venture capital boot camp and invested in his first deal. And he said, you know what, Earl, interesting enough, I grew up here in San Francisco, but I actually was never part of Silicon Valley until this year, right? Because it is a closed ecosystem, right? The know-how, the knowledge, the networks are typically locked in to only a select few, right? And that's something that we want to demystify. And I think that's why places like the venture mechanics is so interesting, right? Because you want to like have this knowledge networks and ecosystem built for all of us but not necessarily lock it in, right? So this is the old boys club, literally, and there's a picture in Newsweek. I think this is 2016, and it is true, right? So we said, how do we write a book to actually demystify what I think the secret of Silicon Valley is, which is the mindset of a startup, a venture-backed startup founder, right? So I just had this picture here, which is the UN, right, from the UN website. And I realized, like, we need to also think about, how do we unlock the secrets of Silicon Valley so that opportunity gets locked out of places like Silicon Valley and then democratized to the rest of the world, right? So that more people will have opportunity to create wealth and generational wealth, potentially for themselves and their family in the future, right? And then another thing that I thought about as I reflected on this talk today is this power of someone like me, right? Someone like us, right? Because there was just a new poll actually from Gallup and Amazon just last year that says that positive role models are most likely to have a fulfilling career, establishing a career, and a career that pays high enough compared to someone who does not have and grew up with a positive role model or someone they look up to, right? So that's something that I was like thinking about is how can we be each other's role models, right? How can we be each other's inspiration to take it to the next level, right? Because it's not easy. I'm sure for all the founders, you probably ask yourself, this is probably the hardest job I had in the world, right? For investors, actually, so I used to invest, and I thought like investing is hard, right? Like, oh my gosh, like one of the companies might blow up, I'm in boards, etc. But then when I transitioned to becoming a founder, I realized that being a founder is like 100 times more difficult than being an investor because you are literally the investor of one company, your company, right? And you literally live or die based on the success of your company, right? So as I transitioned from an investor to a founder, my respect to founders went up by also 100x, right? So, and that's kind of part and partial what the book is, Startup Mindset, right? It's like really decoding what is those mindsets that set startup founders apart, and what are those questions really to take it from thinking about an idea, being what I call as a wanna-preneur, into actually an entrepreneur, right? Because to be honest with you, and probably ask your friends too, like a lot of people want to start companies. They talk about it in family gatherings, friendships, sports, when you watch sports. Actually, very few people are like all of you, right, who want to start something. A lot of people dream to start a company, but very few people do. And that's the question that I wanted to answer, right? So, I'm a Swiftie, right? So I'm a father of a two-year-old baby girl. I have two older middle school and high school boys, so 10-year gap in between. But I always like Taylor Swift. And one of the first quotes that I put in my book was this one, which is kind of interesting, right? Being fearless isn't being 100% not fearful. It's actually being scared, but you still do it anyway, right? I never thought Taylor Swift would be in my book, at least the quote, right? But I thought it was a cool one. So this is something like really the thought of an entrepreneurship, right? Like which is you're not sure, right? Most startups start with the idea, but ultimately end with an idea that actually is not the same as when you started the company, right? For example, the startup that I founded started with like, we should create data and machine learning in order to create an alternative credit score, and ultimately became a payments application, right? That retailers used. So it wasn't what we started, and to be honest, that's also not what venture capital invested in, right? They invested in, to be honest, most of the time, it's you and yourself and your team and your vision. And the vision could potentially, the how of the vision could change, but the vision typically is still clear, right? So with that, I'll give you like the 5 questions really fast, right? On like 5 questions I think either you now as a founder, or 5 questions that ultimately, if you want to start a company, you should at least have a very good answer to these questions, right? So everybody knows this graph, right? the graph of like what is the difference between a venture scale startup revenue or profitability versus a traditional SME, right? And this is something that I underestimated, and most people actually don't understand, right? Unless you're in the venture ecosystem. So ultimately, business is business, but not necessarily, right? So traditional SME is linear, right? So the question is, are you bound by linear thinking, right? And linear thinking just means that I will put in $1, I can predictably get $3 in the end, right? That is linear thinking or linear business thinking. But most venture scale startups don't think this way, right? They think of like, yeah, how do I create different metrics? User growth, revenue growth. So I don't know. Who here has raised venture capital before? Maybe a number of you, right? A couple, right? So ultimately, and I was telling you a while ago, like the biggest surprise for me to raise venture capital, I thought getting funding was awesome, right? Like, oh, we got funding, this is it, let's party. What I realized that once you get venture funding, it is not your company anymore. Literally, even 1%, 0.1% of the company you give to a VC, it's not your company anymore. And once you get outside capital, especially professional venture capital, you have to then transpose your mind from this linear thinking into venture scale thinking, which means that you have to grow at a minimum 15% month on month, right? 15% month on month growth. So the moment you get outside capital, if you don't grow 15% month on month, then you're typically already at the bottom 50% of VC scaled companies, right? So that is scary. I mean, I'm not telling you this is like scary stuff, right? Imagine that you have to grow every month while the baseline is going up 15% month on month, and you have to keep at it for 18, 24, 36 months every month, right? So in fact, for us in my startup before, we had a dashboard that we look at the metrics every day, right? So that's something to think about. Like, how do you then transpose yourself, and are you ready mentally to basically think about venture scale, right? So because building a business you think is simple, but venture business is a lot more complicated. This is something that I also like underestimated, which is most of us think that building a startup is part of your career, right? It's like, oh, actually, it's my next step. I'm a product manager. I'll be a startup founder, etc. One thing that I wish I knew is maybe, and someone never taught me this, which is like maybe you should think about building a startup and de-risking it first before you make the leap, right? Which is counterintuitive to most of my VC colleagues, right? And the reason is that, one of my former startups, I used to work in Schwab, so we did portfolio management. I worked also at the hedge fund, Bridgewater, which is a big hedge fund. Why is it that the largest financial institutions in the world think about a balanced portfolio, but very few of us think about a balanced career portfolio, which means that at any given time, how do you make sure you balance both risk and reward, right? So being a startup founder or entrepreneur is purely high risk, high reward, which is fine. But then you have to think, is that the right situation for you at that particular point in time of like putting it at the high risk, high reward part of your portfolio, right? So if you look at it even from a financial perspective, when you're relatively young, you can go all in stocks, high risk stocks, crypto, etc. But then as you go towards maybe a little bit more closer to retirement, that's more of like how do you balance it with a more balanced portfolio, which is mostly like low risk, right? So my thought here is how do you make sure that you are ready at your point in your life, not even career, what type of portfolio mix you should have from a risk-reward perspective, right? And very few people do. And if you're a pure entrepreneur, you actually don't think this way. You think like, I'm just going to go all in, right? That's just normal, which is fine. But you have to think about it that way. Another thing that I wasn't sure is venture-backed founders, and the ones that we keep on talking to during the research of the book, is the ambition is typically scale, right? Scale at the millions, if not billions of users. And the question really is that are we also, again, mentally ready to think about that, right? And at the same time, this is what we call the three focus filters, or three questions you have to ask to know, like, is your ambitions tied into, the dream of the company, right? Like, what geography are you going to focus on? Is the geography large enough for you to actually like create enough scale, right? How much users do you want to impact ultimately for that company? And then what is that function, or what is that area that you have an unfair advantage on, right? And if you can answer those three questions, then it's easy for you to focus what your startup is about. But very ultimately, what I've seen is that many founders actually do not answer these three questions. They just start a company, and when you ask them, what is the scale ambition? And they say, okay, yeah, I might want to have like 1 million users someday. And I'm like, what is your focus of your geography? How can you get 1 million users? And it's very hard to answer, right? So I think it's more of this, like, how do you make sure you have the right focus filter as you start a company? Yeah, that's my baby girl, as I mentioned a while ago. That's why I have Taylor Swift, right? Do you know the superpower in kryptonite? So this is from the Marvel Disney cruise, right? And most founders don't, at least something to think about as founders, right? Like, and be honest for yourself is, what are you really the best at in the world, right? What are you the best at in the world? And can your company, because of you, beat out the large tech companies going after the same space as you, right? So are you what they call the N equals 1? Is that your superpower? And the superpowers might not be an industry. It might be you're just the best salesperson in the world in real estate, for example, right? Maybe you're the best salesperson in enterprise tech. Maybe you're the best product manager in AI, right? Maybe you're the best person in government relations in going to a very regulated industry, right? Your company will lean onto your superpower, and literally that's what differentiates your company from the rest of the companies. And then the last one, which most people have to really reflect on, is what is your kryptonite, which is like ultimately what are you not good at, right? And what are the things that you need help with? And that's how you form a balanced team, ultimately, right? So my last question, which is the question, so I went to Stanford. This is like the Stanford question, right? What matters to you most and why? And when all of you start a company, and most are founders, right? Like, hopefully you have already, like, what's your vision, and what is your impact statement or your mission, and what is the core values of the company, right? And a lot of times this is like kind of funny MBA exercises that like people say like this is like not so smart, because why do you have to write this down and nobody really reads it? So most people in big tech, they get inculcated by HRs like, here's the mission and values. But ultimately, if you are grounded on why you start the company and what is the values of the company, it will filter so much things. Who employees you hire, who investors you get, right? What decisions you make if it's literally like going against your values and your ethics as a founder, right? A lot of times when I was there, we declined investors because they didn't believe in the same values as we did, right? We declined customers because of it. We declined really great, amazing talent because of it, right? But ultimately, you have to be grounded, especially during times of like stress, right? And raising money is like very stressful. And when your burn rate goes to less than 6 months, very stressful. And then you can make kind of decisions that you potentially will regret. And so in the beginning, you have to at least be very clear on what matters to you most and why the company matters to you most and why, right? So, yeah, so those are like kind of the 5 questions that I wanted to share with you as a founder, as an investor. And then I was a 90s person watching basketball, right? And ultimately, Michael Jordan said something that still until this day makes me think, right? Which is some people want it to happen, some people wish it would happen, but others make it happen. So kudos to this room because you make it happen, right? So thank you so much.